Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our today's session on it is the 10th km4dev knowledge Kcafe on uncomfortable truths in the global development. And I'm happy to be one of your moderators today and have my other teams facilitating together with Helen, Rosho, and Oje. I'm going to give the brief outline about the session. So kindly, maybe you can share in the chat the place where you're joining us from. The Kcafe, it has two main parts. There's a panel discussion with a fishbowl, which Helen will be explaining to us. And there are also the breakout rooms and discussions which will be facilitated by Jorge. So about km4dev, km4dev is a global network community of various international development practitioners and researchers who are interested in knowledge management and interested to share knowledge and arising issues regarding KM theories. We have more than 2,000 members, and so far we have been there since we are more than 20 years old. And recently we celebrated our Knowledge Cafe's 20th anniversary this year, June. We had many people representing almost more than 70 countries. We are so happy. We are happy to have you also to be part of our member. Feel free to join. You'll go there after this. You go to our km4dev website. The membership is free. So welcome everyone. Those who are members and those who are non-members of km4dev, you're welcome to our today's knowledge Ccafe. So there's quite a lot of the summary discussions regarding this Ccafe. There's been a lot of ongoing about the uncomfortable truth in the development sector. And the discussion came up with when Hendrix-Jenkins opened up with a conversation regarding the more she learned about the supremacy mindset and the language that expresses it, the more she appreciated the depth of change needed across the development sector. And Anne went further to share an article which triggered a lot of conversation and a lot of the uncomfortable truths that are happening in the development sector. She shared with us what is killing us in the international NGOs. And there's quite a lot of uncomfortable truths that many of us need to face. That's according to Han. And to do so, we have to face up to our own responsibilities. Each one of us is responsible to challenge these the truths that are happening. So we are calling all of us to stand up against these the wrong things that are happening, which we see, and to foster the new generations of the international NGOs, whereby we can be proud of to say there's quite a lot of that are happening. Where like now we be focusing on what other members are sharing. Krishor noted that the uncomfortable truth with the racial and colonial supremacy of language is not about the processes, but the results are, if anything is about dignity and equality, he further observed that this discussion was getting even more worse, and it is being dominated by justifying the use of the rata supremacy, which is more of the colonial language. Jessica, who has worked in international development for only 2 years, has deeply troubled by her experiences. And she felt that to an extent that she was questioning whether she will continue to work in the development sector or to quit her job. There are other many respondents. Charles introduced another perspective when he talked about the endemic nature of some of the injustices, which includes, for instance, the calls for proposals. And in quotes, he put about the marriages of convenience with the organizations in the North, whereby there's that kind of a marriage, the kind of the reports and the proposals that we write to send it to the West for the people in the global, in the North global to get the fund and the South. Yeah, so Eurasia responded, Eurasia is from Kenya. She responded that being from the global South, the article resonated well with some of the foreign aid practices that are happening where she's working. And she said here, also, instead of pointing out fingers, it has made her to look into a new self, how she could implement in her role and in the workplace. But she said, yeah, let's just say, I will do better. So at the end of this session, all of us, we are going to do better. The learnings that we are going and the lessons that we are learning from our teams, we are going to change the narrative in our organizations. Harwin Paley stressed that we need to engage the local people who can see the limitation of what is proposed, can be suggested better solutions, and know what are willing to be involved. We need to engage more people in the development sector, especially the local communities. For instance, like you're going to implement projects without engaging these people to own enough the ownership of the project. For further, you can go to our, there's quite a lot of the discussions, ongoing discussion in our km4dev list. So the discussion is still ongoing and you're very welcome to join and share. So to link up with the previous knowledge cafe on decolonization of knowledge, we will now show you the playing video about the decolonization of knowledge. It will only take 3 minutes.
Decolonization of knowledge, so far underrepresented from Global South in many different ways. The Agenda Knowledge for Development, which is strengthening Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, address this issue by looking into new ways at local knowledge and the way in which large organizations in the United Nations are working in the global knowledge ecology. With this, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Charles Dewa, Chief Executive Officer of Knowledge Transfer Africa Limited, based in Zimbabwe. He's working at the intersection of formal and informal agricultural markets across Africa. A long-time member of km4dev core group. So Charles, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Fitsum, and welcome to everybody. I want to propose 2 pathways for decolonizing knowledge. One of decolonizing evaluation. The notion of evaluation remains a Western notion. There's a notion of theory of change that is accompanying most of evaluation. In most cases, it's not clear whose theories and whose changes we are seeking. So we think maybe it's important to look at the theories and values of people that are supposed to be developed.
Bruce Boyce, editor and lead writer of the award-winning Real Knowledge Management magazine, and he has also been teaching academic English. Over to Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fitson. The purpose of Real KM magazine is to support evidence-based knowledge management, and we do this through presenting KM and related research in concise articles. KM research itself is very much oriented towards the global north, and in fact 2/3 comes from the United States, the United Kingdom and Europe. In particular, Africa, South America and Southeast Asia are very much absent. In parallel, there's a much deeper problem of the dominance of Western epistemology. There are fundamentally different conceptualizations of knowledge across the world, linked to fundamentally different philosophies and cultural foundations. We have to realize that the way in which people think about knowledge is very different across the world. We need to look at how we can create opportunities for people to come face to face in constructive dialogue. My own journey in this regard has enabled me to, in fact, learning from Chinese students about KM constructs that are actually far more valuable.
We will be looking into the individual knowledge management for development perspectives and organizational actions.
Yes, Fitsum, we have to close.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I know most of you also have other commitments.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Rosho, for sharing with us the video. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Rosho to take us through what is expected during the breakout sessions. And then thereafter, introduce Helen, who is our facilitator today and our chat moderator. Yeah. Thank you, Rosho.
So I know everybody is already very familiar with the use of Zoom, but just a quick recap. We are recording the session for the sake of sharing it afterwards, and we will have a summary video in our YouTube channel. Please, if you are not talking, keep your microphone in mute to avoid any disruption. If you experience problems with the signal, sometimes it's better just to switch off, restart the computer and connect again. And just we hope that you will enjoy the session with an open mind and respect for everyone else's opinion. So today we will have a session of a fishbowl. I'm gonna let Helen play that and introduce this part.
Hi everyone. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with the fishbowl, but just in case, and especially because we're doing it virtually, I'll just explain very, very briefly. The fishbowl is a small group of people in an inner circle, which is the fishbowl, surrounded by a larger outside circle of observers. Today we'll start off with 4 people in the inner circle, and I will introduce them one by one. Who'll present their particular perspectives on uncomfortable truths in development. We'll then open up to all of you briefly, so that you can also have your say. In a physical fishbowl session, you usually leave a chair free, an extra chair, so that people can come in to sit in that chair and speak. But in this virtual environment, it will be a bit different and probably more difficult to facilitate. During the initial part, we'll ask everyone, apart from the 4 people in the inner circle, to turn off your cameras. Everybody turn off your cameras. We'd also encourage you to change from gallery view to speaker view so that you can see the person who's speaking, obviously, rather than a whole lot of names. When we open up to the broader group, we'll ask you to raise your blue hand or write in the chat that you would like to speak, and we'll be doing our best. Jorge Chavez and I will be doing our best to monitor that. But if we, so please bear with us, but if we miss someone, please just insist, maybe yell at that point. So if we're okay, I'd like to ask you all to now turn off your cameras, except for the 4 panel members and Stacey, Kishor and Sarah, and switch to speaker view. So I'd just like to introduce Anne Hendrix-Jenkins. Anne has more than 32 years of experience in international development, dating back to her days in the Peace Corps as a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana. Since then, her work has taken her to dozens of countries as a facilitator, trainer, program designer and manager, researcher, and so on. She's also worked on many kinds of programs, and increasingly her work is focused on community-led development and appreciative approaches. She sees a future that benefits from state-of-the-art approaches to capacity development and sustainability, including systemic approaches, inclusive engagement, and true co-creation from the outset. Personally, I'd like to commend Anne for speaking out honestly and courageously, because it does take courage if you're working in development to speak about uncomfortable truths that we all, or many of us, often fail to acknowledge. So I'd like to hand over now to Anne.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's great to be here. So thank you for the introduction. The event for the km4dev community that's been a wonderful constant in my career for 20 years now. I can always count on you all for really thinking hard about things and communicating and engaging beautifully. I have to say, it's not easy to put myself out there like this. I'm speaking today as an individual representing my own personal views. I've had friends reach out to me and they're worried I'm endangering my career. But I have been inspired by people and protesters around the world, and my conscience said to go for it. So here I am, and happy to be with you all. So today I'm focusing a little bit on what I call the personal professional perspective, and that is those of us who are personally devoted to doing meaningful professional work. When I wrote these articles, I was pretty shocked by the 25,000 reads. But what really hit home has been a flood of personal outreach that I received from around the world. The messages are heartfelt, they're plaintive, they're angry, they're dispirited, and they're rebellious. And the kind of people I'm hearing from represent many roles. They work at all levels. They care deeply about inequality, climate change, poverty, dehumanization, and they do believe change is possible, which is great. So I compiled them into a document that is currently at 50 pages and growing. And it reads like a rolling therapy session, a tell-all, and a technical critique of our field, sort of all in one. And here's one quote. This hit me so hard, I refuse to stand down from endorsing this critique. It's important for others to come out of the woodwork and say it like it is, and enough is enough. So the people I'm hearing from describe having to do their best work under the radar so as not to attract attention of insecure bosses and organizations. And when they do attract attention, payback comes in many forms, including if they express doubt or suggest alternatives, they get disinvited to key meetings in one extreme, and then another extreme is straight out getting laid off when their position gets eliminated. So we even have a joke now that if you haven't been laid off, you haven't been trying hard enough. Here's another quote. The portrayal of the aid sector problems is brilliant and also painfully familiar. I learned the hard way what happens when you argue for organizational integrity instead of falling in line with the corporatization of our sector. It didn't go well. So those I hear a lot from our local partners, and we'll hear more from Kishor. And I worry that all of this outpouring represents a canary in a coal mine for international development. And it reads like a workforce that is ready to either give in or rise up, hopefully rise up. Here's another quote. I'm a bit apprehensive about moving so far away from my global health background, but I just tell myself that I'm not happy now. I don't see a career path that will keep me moving, and I have lost faith in the mission. So maybe a bold move is what I need right now. Another person wrote me, I left because I felt like I was propping up a resource wasting white colonialist juggernaut and was ashamed. So to sum it up in 2 points, I think what you might say, what is leaving our collective canary breathless is what you could call the projectization of international development. And their gasping request is to shift the balance back from these predominantly top-down, outside-imposed, expert-driven, siloed, projectized development to the development we've already been talking about, one that is co-created with people whose lives will be affected. Another source of oxygen for our canaries might be found in the increasing calls for locally driven systems approaches. These come under different names that includes community-led development, collective impact, new power, and movement approaches. And increasing evidence shows that they actually do work as well as being right way to move forward. The number one characteristic of a systems approach is adapting, because we live in a dynamic real world and things are not always predictable. But in order to adapt, you need the space and capacity for the workers and for the partners to speak up and say when things aren't working, or express their doubts and say what is working. And then they need to be able to adapt accordingly without a 6-month delay in, a request for a budget change or something. And I just want to finish with one last quote, which is from a senior and still idealistic development professional. He wrote to me, he said, if I were young, I would not consider a job in international development. I would consider a job in sustainable social and human development because it's a great and worthy vocation. And I would still try to get hired so that I can work in Mauritania or Palestine because, oh my God, I love these places. If that were not possible, I guess I'd have to work in other developing countries like France or the United States. So I will stop there.
Thanks a lot, Anne. A lot for us to take on and think about. I was just sort of wondering, I've been in development for more than 25 years myself, and I'm sort of you see these waves of and we embrace community-led development, community-driven development. What will it take for the development sector, the people, for us to learn definitively that works? What will it take? Okay, I'd like to hand over now to Krishor Pradhan. Kishor has more than 25 years of experience in the development sector, in organizational development, project design and implementation, project cycle management with an emphasis on research, KM, communication advocacy, innovation, and communication for development. He's worked full-time in various senior management positions. And in 2012, he established a development consultancy, which provides services in the areas of development research, KM, communication, and more. Kishor's articulate and often hard-hitting comments and observations on the km4dev list have challenged and shaken up the thinking of many of us, I believe, on the difficult issues that we have before us today. Kishor's narrative should have been posted onto Kishor's narrative. I think Sarah's going to post it into the chat. so that people can also download that. So I'd like to hand over to Kishor.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you first to Knowledge Management for Development Community, especially Sarah for starting all this. And of course, everybody else who are participating and have been members of this Knowledge Management for Development for a long time, more than 20 years, I guess. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on how I have seen development and why I'm pushing for dignity and equality, why equality and dignity has become so important for me in development, and which I think is very necessary if you are going to do development more meaningfully rather than making it just very technocratic or like, you know, what Anne was saying about like making it top down and not adaptive and all that. So I would like to be very honest from the very beginning. Some of the things I'm going to say may not be very nice or like something else which we usually discuss in development, which may be very uncomfortable. But since we are talking about uncomfortable truth, something else we do have to talk about at some point to make things better. So I'm going to talk about some of my experiences. So the topic I've chosen is SAM of equality and dignity in development. So basically what I'm trying to say is like why when development has been always pushing for equality, this world is for everybody else, like there should be dignity for everybody else, a choice to live and all that. So that is not really happening. So I have prepared a write-up, a script, which I have shared with Sarah and other colleagues in Knowledge Management for Development. And like Helen said, it will be posted on the chat also. You can refer to that if you miss out on something else, what I'm saying, or if it is not very clear. So I'm just going to read out what I have in the script. This topic, as I have chosen, stems from the very basic premise that development is supposed to endeavor to make the world equal and dignified for everybody. Everybody, when I say everybody, it means everybody else from the global south or north. But due to the truth that development has been theorized and conceptualized historically and pervasively from the global south, or what Anne had written in her writers based on cultural supremacy and capitalism, or which we may simply understand as Western or white culture, the notion of development, SAM of equality and dignity. The implicit Western or white, a global North bias of development, consequently, we see is reflected in the lack of equality and dignity in actual development practices and languages being used in development. So, especially these inequality and the dignity issues are felt more by people who are from the global South, because they always have been, though on the receiving end, but like, it's like, you know, frankly speaking, it's like a recipient, a donor and a beggar relation also. When you always have to beg for your development, give me this, your government is doing that, then you have to empathize what really you have to go through. You know, I mean, looking at it more in humanistic terms rather than, you know, I mean, economic terms. So I don't feel very proud that World Bank gives Nepal $4 billion, because I'm pretty sure, like, given my more than 30 years experience, it's not going to work. What happens with that $30 billion? You know, because Nepal has a population of 30 million and Nepal gets billions and billions of dollars for development. So very simple mathematics, simple economics. If the money that comes to Nepal as development aid is just given to the poorest people, say about 20% of them, I'm sure like they'll have a house, they'll have a drinking water, they'll have a toilet, they have a deposit to send their kids to school. But very sadly, development does not work that way. You know what I mean? So I was saying that how there are so many instances of like that SAM of equality and dignity for people from a global South in actual development practices, But some of the most important ones are like how decisions are made and the power relations. How they are practiced, who participates, who decides. I mean, it's very simple as like, we used to have PRSP earlier, Poverty Reduction Strategy Program, and we moved on to MDGs, 10 Millennium Development Goals, and now we have SDGs. I mean, these were something else which was decided somewhere else, basically, of course, in the West, maybe in DC, Washington, DC by World Bank or UN or like, the big development actors, what some writers call the Lords of Poverty and all that. But I mean, if you still go to a village in Nepal, they don't know what is SDG. I mean, like, they are not bothered about what is SDG. All I want is a clean drinking water. That's it. I mean, it's not a goal for me, development. For me, it's to have a respectful, dignified life. That's more important for me rather than meeting those goals and like, all those numbers, data and all that. So yeah, these are some of the things where there is no equality in like how development is being decided, how we are going to develop somebody else living in Nepal or some other so-called, developing countries. And I would like to emphasize theorizing development, as development has not been accurate enough, like I said, given that countries like Nepal has been receiving development aid for more than 7 decades almost now. And we still don't know, like, if I ask an expert, or if you ask me also, I don't know how Nepal can actually develop. At some point, I mean, it used to be like, okay, it's conflict now. The priority is conflict. Now it's climate change. Before that, it used to be education. It used to be public health. I mean, so if you go to the villages and if you can speak the local language, and if you are nice enough to talk with the people, the truth they will tell you is like, we have been hearing, we call development in Nepal, in Nepali, because, we have been hearing this for such a long time, we don't see what really because is, right? But having said that, again, it's not there in the script. What people still ask for in the villages is like, give me road infrastructure, give me education, and give me health. So it's very simple. Give me roads, infrastructures, right? So I can reach the market, I can send kids to a proper school and all that, education and health, right? So I don't know how these things, what is the priority as development for the people who are actually supposed to be developed gets factored into, how we decide on development. That's where I see like the inequality of decision making and like, who has the power to decide. And another inequality, to give an example, is on how the development economy gets distributed also. I have given an example of how in a project that I was involved with, it was already decided by the donor how much of money would be spent locally and how much money will be spent on international experts, their travel, blah, 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 and all that. So if you look at the data I've given in there in my screen, it's quite appalling. Like, the workers are more from the aid receiving countries, which is like 70 to 30, 70% of the workers, the consultants are from the aid receiving countries. The 30% are the international consultants. But if you look at the budget, how it is being predetermined to be spent, it's just the opposite. 70% of the budget gets spent on the international consultants and the 30 on the local contractor and the local consultants. So there's a lot of like inequality in sharing the development pie also. I'm pretty sure like those who have been working from so-called aid receiving countries would add to this, especially like continents like Africa and all that also. So all these inequalities in theorization practices we see is so much systematically like, embedded by the languages used also. If I ask for a rate for an international consultant rate living in Nepal, I'm told like your GDP is so justified, it's so legitimized. Like, your country's GDP is like this. we have created a benchmark. It cannot go beyond this point, but you are expected to deliver the same quality of work, which the so-called international consultant is supposed to, deliver. What I'm saying is basically the equality we do not have gets reflected in how we practice development and the languages we use also. And all these are leading to as long as I'm not being part of it, of course, there have been participatory approach, participatory planning and all that, but it's still there used to be PRA, participatory rural appraisal. You are not being part of the process. You don't own it. So there's no ownership, like what Anne said, projectization of development. It just gets limited to the project. So after the project, nobody really bothers about what really happened. So it was a 5 years project, something else happened in 5 years, it never gets sustained. These things, these nuances in development practices we have are basically, I bring it down to 3 points, is balancing the powers, the ownership, and being more accountable to the people. And if we can do these, I think we can bring about change and make development more dignified and equal. So I would like to wrap up there, and sorry for the long narrative. So I hope I would be able to answer if you have questions later on. Yeah.
Thanks, Kishor.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll move on quickly to Stacey. Stacey Young is USAID's first agency KM and Organizational Learning Officer. She was appointed in November 2019. Prior to that, she served as the Senior Learning Advisor at USAID's Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning. And under her leadership, some of you would be aware of this, USAID developed an holistic approach to collaborating, learning and adapting, CLA, that is now integrated into USAID's country programs. CLA is acknowledged as a leading example of learning and adaptive management for international development. More recently, Stacey led a major initiative at USAID to develop the evidence base for collaborating, learning and adapting. She co-chairs on behalf of USAID the Multi-Donor Learning Partnership, which works to advance organizational learning in KM in international development. I find Stacey's deep commitment to advancing learning and collaboration in development inspiring, and thank you for taking part in this discussion today. Stacey.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks for that introduction. And I want to note also that Helen is a member of the Multi-Donor Learning Partnership, and I have so enjoyed our collaboration through that body. I wanted to say a bit today about what we can do differently and better, specifically as knowledge workers, to address the uncomfortable truths and the supremacy models that the other panelists have so eloquently critiqued. And in particular, I wanted to give a couple of examples to illustrate my point that there are alternatives available to us now and today. We don't have to wait to do better. As knowledge workers, we grapple with 3 big issues, at least: types of knowledge and the status of evidence, sources of knowledge, and engaging knowledge holders inclusively. And just as supremacy can embed in any or all of these, supremacy can also be countered in all of these. So first, in terms of the types of knowledge that are valued and the status of evidence, instead of embracing a linear continuum that I think a lot of us encounter in our organizations, in which evidence that's proven using scientific methods is seen as the strongest and best evidence, and experience is seen as the weakest or dismissed altogether, we can instead consider all types of evidence that are available to us and which questions they are specifically good for answering, the particular role for each type of evidence, and draw on them accordingly. And as we do that, we can also notice how the ways that types of knowledge that are valued unevenly tend to align with systems of power and privilege. So what's considered best and questioning how that might mute perspectives specifically from developing communities. The second issue, sources of knowledge. This is linked to types of knowledge. And this gets at whose knowledge is valued as legitimate, and the critically important question of why we don't routinely begin with the knowledge, ideas, and priorities of developing country communities. Huge question. And if we start there, I think that definitely points us in the direction of working differently. And then third, engaging knowledge holders inclusively. And here I'll invoke the example of still my favorite book in development, Time to Listen, Hearing People on the Receiving End of International Aid. I'm sure many of you have read that book. And so you're familiar that it contains insights from 6,000 people in 125 organizations in 20 countries who took part in a listening project. The book argues strongly for cumulative experience as a type of high quality and essential knowledge. And I think that's really important. It also demonstrates an intentional listening methodology that explicitly mitigates the interviewer's biases to ensure that respondents' views are clearly understood and respectfully considered. So what happens when you use that approach? Lo and behold, you get a resounding consensus on what's needed, which is to move from what the book calls an externally driven aid system to a collaborative aid system. And you also get clear and concrete recommendations for how to move from the one system to the other. And these include things such as collaborating with local colleagues as drivers of their own development, very different from approaching them with a pre-cooked proposal or approach. Also focusing on reinforcing local capacities and existing strengths, as opposed to looking for problems and deficits. Making decisions collaboratively is something that we can do a lot more of in the aid system. Fitting money and timing to strategy and not the other way around, that would be an enormous change, and it is something that the participants in Time to Listen had resounding consensus around. There are other examples as well, and I urge you to read the book if you haven't already. A second example I wanted to mention goes beyond welcoming in the knowledge of people in developing communities to combining it with Western frameworks to advance substantive change. So just briefly, this is an example from Ecuador, where activists combined Western cultural elements of constitutional protections and non-Western cultural elements of nature as the source of all rights in order to enshrine in the Constitution the rights of nature in a way that enabled environmental protections as constitutionally protected. So it was a really clever alignment of Western and local or indigenous knowledge systems. And then finally, I just wanted to mention Linda Tuiwai-Smith. She's the author of Decolonizing Methodologies. She and Fiona Cram have articulated a set of Kaupapa Maori principles for research and evaluation that are also relevant for development. And they have to do with things like building reciprocal and culturally respective relationships, being generous with knowledge and ensuring that it flows both ways, engaging with people on their own terms, showing humility when sharing knowledge, and so forth. So I think that there are a number of these examples, and many of you participating in this Knowledge Cafe may have your own examples of methods, concrete specific methods that you're using currently to counter supremacy and development. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stacey. I'll move on now to Sarah Cummings, but just before I do, I think we're going over time. We're quite significantly over time, actually, because we want to have 2 rounds of breakouts. So since this fishbowl doesn't really look like a fishbowl, it actually looks like a panel more than anything else. How about, I'd like to suggest that people put their comments and questions into the chat. I hope that people will be okay about that. We can see. I'll wait to hear from Rocio if we can ask a couple of people to talk. Yeah, and then I mean, for sure we'll follow up with another fishbowl with a tougher facilitator, I think, next time. So now I'll hand over to Sarah. I think many of you, everybody probably knows Sarah. She doesn't need an introduction. Currently working as the public-private partnership and research uptake expert at Wageningen University in the Netherlands on a grant from the Dutch Research Council. She has many fields of interest, including the private sector, obviously KM and knowledge brokering for development, and decolonization of knowledge, particularly in publishing. Sarah is the founder of the community-based open access KM4 development journal, met for many years ago. And we all know Sarah is a very active member of the km4dev community, both as a contributor to discussions and as a volunteer, tireless volunteer in the community's core group. I collaborate often with Sarah, and I really appreciate her dedication, incisive thinking, and incredible energy. So I'll hand over to Sarah.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much for your kind words. I'm not quite sure I deserve it, but we can discuss that another time. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this discussion as a canary in a fishbowl, talking on the uncomfortable truths in global development. And I think it's really important that km4dev is a space where we can talk about these issues, and to quote here from Kishor, with respect and dignity. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement has resonated with many of us, and there really are a growing number of spaces or niches, if you talk in terms of systems, where this type of discussion is taking place. And I'd like to mention a few of them. So you have IKM Emergent, which is a research project which closed some years ago actually, but the similar discussions were taking place. And it's really nice for me to see Mike Powell of IKM Emergent in this Kcafe. Another one is Decolonizing Higher Education, which is a list run from the UK, which is really interesting. And Alex Lewis is also here from that discussion. And after this talk, I'll put the links to these discussions in the chat. And another one is Convivial Thinking. And Lata Narayanaswamy, who's a member of km4dev, is one of the movers and shakers of that group. And if you know of any other similar spaces, it would be really great to hear about them. So please put them in the chat or email me afterwards. So very recently, I wrote a book chapter with two colleagues from Wageningen University on a systemic approach to decolonization of knowledge, implications for scholars of development studies. And I think it had two innovative aspects, and they actually be mirrored in some of the discussions coming up today. And one of them is like taking a systemic approach to the problem, because it's a really difficult one. And it's really embedded in our landscapes and institutions. And it also focused on action and activism and what can, in this case, scholars do to address this issue. And I'm also really, in km4dev spirit, I'm really happy to share this chapter. If anybody is interested, just drop me a line. Actually, it's a very draft version at the moment. And as Helen noticed, it's got quite a lot of typos. So you have to read through those, I think. Okay, so based on the research from my chapter, two concepts stood out for me in making it easier to discuss uncomfortable truths. And I actually had to really laugh at myself, and my partner really laughed very, very hard when I said I was going to try and explain two quite complex concepts during a lightning talk. But here goes. So the first one is coloniality, which represents entrenched power dynamics and patterns of knowledge creation and use, which have emerged from accidental power relations of colonial domination. And I think really this is a real issue in international development because, we look around us and we sometimes forget that all of the institutions and quite often our behavior that we take for granted is rooted in this colonial history. So coloniality, I think, is an important one. And one example of this, I think, is academic publishing, which was discussed by Bruce Boyce in the Decolonization of Knowledge Cafe. Academic publishing is very much dominated by the US and UK. And it is based on these patterns that we're looking at, these historical patterns. Okay, I've got one more, and this is the most difficult, so bear with me. I have 1 minute left, I think. Okay, so this one is willful hermeneutic injustice. So you have this epistemic injustice can be divided into two concepts, which is really testimonial injustice, in which the testimony of certain people have more weight than others. And as we know, like local people and women, for example, people are not listening to them, and what they say people don't see as very convincing or authentic. Okay, and the other one is hermeneutic injustice is where a socially disadvantaged group is blocked from access to knowledge. And willful hermeneutic injustice is when it's done on purpose. Scholars are arguing that this is the result of ethically bad knowledge practices. So that comes down to us with our efforts to do ethically good knowledge practices. So these are two concepts that I wanted to highlight as potentially useful in these discussions. And thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. We do have a lot of comments coming through in the chat, and I would really encourage people to continue to put comments in the chat and questions, and we will save the chat and pass the questions on to the panelists. Now I'm going to hand over, and I do apologise for not being able to call other people into the fishbowl. That I'll now hand over to Jorge, who will facilitate the breakout rooms.
Yes, thank you, Helen. Yeah, it is really a pity that we cannot invite more people to speak like this as part of the fishbowl, because there's really a lot to say. But we really want to hear from everybody, of course. That is the whole point of this meeting. So we want to invite everybody to talk, to share more ideas. I hope you are all seeing my screen, because we are going to form groups now. So I would like to invite you to think and to share your ideas. We're going to form two groups, and we start with this one. I mean, two breakout sessions. We will start with this one. So Rocio will send us all magically.
Okay, hello everybody. We're still coming back from the breakout rooms. I hope the chat was interesting. There's still a lot of people coming from the breakout rooms. So some of the groups are taking a little bit more time to come back. Okay, I think we are here. Sorry for before, I should very quickly. Sorry. Jorge.
Yeah, you got me. I was talking, so I'm going to take the mic and don't stop talking. Yeah, well, we had a very nice group discussion, and I'm sure you all did in your different groups. Yeah, it was funny that we were talking about not just the context where we are all working, but also our own individual perspective, and this idea of, well, feeling uncomfortable about the way international development is and being run by white Western men, and wondering if we are not all white Western men in the end, the way we do things or we want to do things, our own personal interest, our own personal careers, conflicting with sometimes what we want to do. I would like I would like to get some ideas from you, but I'm going to ask you to do it in the chat again. So once again, I'm going to share my screen here, and I would like you to look at this question, and then in the chat, when I say 1, 2, 3, I would like you to say, what is, from what you've heard, what is the most uncomfortable truth? If you put it in a few words. I would like you all to write on the chat, because then we will go to a second breakout session where we will start thinking, what do we do with this? So just think for 10 seconds, what is the most uncomfortable truth in global development from your perspective? And when I say 1, 2, 3, I would like to put it, you all to put it on the chat. Yes, 1, 2, 3. Can you share your ideas? So development should not be associated with money. There's a lack of transparency. Politicians getting involved. Crowding out local grassroots movements. Power dynamics that still leave women out of decision-making. Power inequalities. We're not listening. Having to plead poverty to escape charges in open access journals. You know, I would like to invite you all, not me reading this and not hearing, but all of you to stay connected to the chat and to go scroll up and down and see what people have been writing. Because then we go, if I may again share my screen, we go to the second. So the question now is, what can we do to address this ourselves? Not our organizations and not the people we work with and not our governments, but what can we do ourselves as individuals, the way we work, to address these points which are there. So these things are written down in the chat. So Rocio is going to send us again to different groups. Just wait a sec, Rocio. And I would like you all then to discuss and then to think of, if you go back to the chat that you are, of course, you can see there, and discuss this. What can we do ourselves? Yes, so we go again.
So welcome back. I hope it was interesting. There is still some groups that are taking a little bit longer. I think everybody's back now.
Yes, and we're running out of time, unfortunately, yes. But we are all back, yes. So once again, I think we had a very nice group, and I thought it was inspiring to see that, yeah, that as individuals, we can do a lot, and we are already doing something. So it is, of course, a lot to do still. I wanted to invite a few of you to say a few words just to close this session. So I want to start with one of the panelists. I asked Stacey if she could say a few words for us. And actually, I would like to ask you to say a few words and then to point to somebody else whom you heard in one of the two groups. Yes? So, and then we go. Please.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'll just, Jorge had asked me to say just a little bit about some of the themes that came up in our breakout. So we had a wide-ranging discussion, everything from offering open access resources to understanding that we don't know what's best for the people on whose behalf we work. And so we need to listen. There was a lot said about humility and also bringing an attitude of service to the work that we're doing. And then I would say finally that there was a lot of emphasis on the systems in which we work and understanding that although we are acting as individuals, we are embedded in larger systems. And so being aware of those as well is really important. So now I would like to call on Tara, who was in my previous breakout group, if she's still with us, because she shared some interesting things in that group. Is Tara Casimir still with us?
Yes, I am still here.
Please tell us some of your ideas.
Well, I mean, I come from, from care provider perspective, and this world in global development is, for me, I'm an outsider. So I see more of the idea of always scaling projects ends up falling into developing large-scale initiatives instead of thinking more of public health as global health, more of if we're really looking to empower and think more towards sort of generalization of what is evidence, what is best practice, what does it look like in Bolivia? Should it look like the same in Dominican Republic? Should it look like the same in Botswana? Should it look like the same in Zimbabwe? The idea for me that is inspired by this panel is reframing what we consider as knowledge and who decides what is knowledge and who prioritizes the interventions. Because in many ways, it's still this esoteric structure, even within the research world, who decides who publishes the papers. So it's many ways the hierarchy, the top down, not only disempowers communities that we help, but also the people who want to investigate and create the knowledge. We always want this idea, let's make things innovative, but we don't want to do the work because that could make the prior knowledge that many people who have developed who are in the positions of power become irrelevant, and it's a threat to their position. So that's, I don't have the solution, but again, it comes to idea of reimagining global development work.
Thank you. Thanks. Would you like to point to somebody who was in your second group? Somebody whom you heard say something?
Katia, who was she was in my first group, but also Charles Dewa. Charles Dewa made from Zimbabwe. You made a great point in talking about entrepreneurship and championing those for building economic capacity. I was inspired by that.
Charles, you're still here. please.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Yes. Well, it's more like my frustrations to say, I'm beginning to think that maybe development has to be carefully done, where we identify champions, people who can really move things from where they are to some other place. Otherwise, other people are satisfied with the status quo. So it's very easy to push people who may not be very keen to imagine a better world or to move to another stage. So maybe focusing on champions to me looks like what I'm doing at the moment, to say, how do I identify people who can move things? Because otherwise we end up thinking we can throw money at people and think things will change, but maybe they won't. So in a nutshell, that's what I think.
And you were in the group probably with some champions. Did you hear, can you point to somebody who you'd invite to say a few words now that we're closing?
Well, I wouldn't mind if Kishor is there to just wrap up, say some of his parting shots. It would be lovely.
We cannot hear you, Kishor. Do your mic.
Yeah, my mic was not on. So what I've been saying is, like, I think for me, ownership is very important. Like what Charles is saying, like, it's not only throwing the money. I give you $10 billion or $1 billion and you are going to develop. That has not worked. We know it. We have to admit, right? So because like what Annie is saying, is community driven. Of course, it has to be community driven. And I would say it has to be owned by the community who are supposed to be developed. So if you look at the case of Nepal, we always, proudly talk about community forestry in Nepal. So community forestry has been very successful in Nepal after the government nationalized it in the 70s, where there was a lot of alienation and there was a lot of felling the trees and all that. So this community ownership of the forest idea was brought by some of the community forest workers. I don't think it happened from the development end, frankly speaking. So which was very indigenous idea. So that's one example we always cite from Nepal, has been successful if we take it as development, because that was owned by the community. The community was empowered to manage the forest, manage the resources, make the decisions themselves. That's why it has been successful. Otherwise, like what Anne has been saying, it does not go beyond being a project. It's just projectization, that's it. So I'm not, like what Charles has been, labeled me as a champion. I'm not a champion, but I try to share such observations, such learning I have as far as possible. Honestly, independently.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
We are running out of time. I would like to invite you to write any new idea, any last idea, that you have in the chat. And while we do that, is there anybody who wants to say some few words? Before we close, I would like to remind you that you can save the chat. There are a lot of good ideas from all of you, so please save it and then you keep everything before we close this session, of course. This is just, let's say, an appetizer, because there's a lot to say and a lot of new ideas and a lot more to explore. But I think we've been, in that sense, successful of raising a few ideas and making all of us think a little bit more. I would really like to thank Anne and Stacey and Kishor and Sarah for preparing this and for sharing your ideas with us. Many, many thanks to the four of you, especially for all what you did beforehand in the discussions, in the emails, all of these ideas, and for summarizing it and presenting it to us here. Many, many thanks from all of us to you. Thank you, Helen, for driving the discussions. Thanks a lot. A difficult fishbowl, but well, it worked very well. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Gladys. I think you're not here with us, which is why I'm taking your place. And of course, thank you, Rocio, behind the scenes making sure that all of this works very well. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. It is really unfortunate that we have to close, but that's how it is. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for sharing us. And we really hope to see you in the last Knowledge Cafe of the year the last, let's say, official one where we will still be celebrating the 20 years of this community. So that will be, if I'm not mistaken, the 17th of December. So you will receive an email. Join us again. Once again, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Good day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.